There exists within each person a profound capacity for mental sharpness that remains largely untapped, lying dormant beneath layers of habit, distraction, and self-imposed limitation. The human mind possesses extraordinary potential, capable of extraordinary feats of memory, creativity, strategic thinking, and resilience. Yet most people never access even a fraction of these capabilities, not because they lack ability, but because they lack awareness of what builds mental acuity and the disciplined commitment to practice the habits that transform potential into tangible prowess. This document explores a transformative journey undertaken by those who have chosen to elevate their cognitive function through deliberate practice. It is a story not of one person, but of every person who has ever decided that their mind deserved better than mediocrity. The narrative that unfolds here charts the course of mental development through 7 fundamental habits that separate those whose minds remain acute throughout their lives from those whose cognitive abilities decline prematurely into fuzziness and decline. The central truth underlying this exploration is both simple and profound. The mind that learns to destroy its own weakness becomes immune to destruction from external forces. When you systematically eliminate the self-imposed limitations, the scattered attention, the undisciplined thinking patterns, and the passive acceptance of mental decline, you create something far more formidable than mere intelligence. You create an unbreakable fortress of cognitive capability that no external adversity can penetrate or diminish. The journey begins with understanding what constitutes mental sharpness. It is not merely the ability to solve complex mathematical problems or recall obscure facts. Rather, true mental sharpness manifests as the capacity to think clearly under pressure, to learn continuously throughout life, to see patterns others miss, to adapt swiftly to new circumstances, to maintain focus amid chaos, and to make sound decisions even when information is incomplete or emotions run high. It is cognitive flexibility combined with unwavering discipline. It is the capacity to hold multiple perspectives simultaneously while still thinking decisively. These qualities are not gifts bestowed upon the fortunate few. They are skills developed through consistent practice and deliberate habit formation. As one moves through life observing high achievers across every domain, whether in business, science, athletics, or the arts, a pattern emerges with remarkable consistency. Those who remain mentally sharp decades into their lives share certain practices in common. They do not rely on innate talent alone. Rather, they have woven specific habits into the fabric of their daily existence. These are not habits that require exotic circumstances or specialized equipment. They are practices accessible to anyone willing to commit to the discipline required to maintain them. The concept of destroying one's weak self is not metaphorical torture or harsh self-judgment. Rather, it describes the process of identifying and systematically eliminating patterns of thinking and behavior that undermine mental performance. The weak self is the part that seeks comfortable distraction rather than engaging in challenging learning. It is the part that accepts the first answer rather than probing deeper for understanding. It is the part that becomes defensive when facing criticism rather than extracting the nugget of truth it might contain. It is the part that follows established patterns merely because they are established, rather than questioning whether those patterns still serve current reality. When the mind learns to recognize and eliminate these patterns of weakness, something remarkable occurs. The person becomes less vulnerable to external criticism because they have already internalized and processed constructive critique. They become less susceptible to setbacks because they view them as data points in a learning process rather than as judgments on their worth. They become resilient against deception because they have cultivated the habit of questioning assumptions and examining evidence carefully. In short, they become difficult to harm precisely because they have done the difficult work of eliminating the internal vulnerabilities that external adversaries would otherwise exploit. Part 1. The Architecture of Mental Development. The first habit that separates those whose minds remain sharp from those whose minds deteriorate is the practice of deliberate learning and intellectual challenge. This habit involves systematically engaging with material and ideas that stretch current understanding beyond its current boundaries. Many people confuse this with mere reading or passive consumption of information. True deliberate learning is active, intentional, and often uncomfortable. The practice of deliberate learning begins with recognizing that the human brain is fundamentally a pattern recognition device. When the brain encounters familiar patterns, it processes information efficiently, drawing on established neural pathways. However, when it encounters novel patterns or information that challenges existing understanding, it must create new neural connections. This process of creating new neural pathways, called neuroplasticity, is what maintains and develops cognitive sharpness across the lifespan. Without the stimulus of novel, challenging information, the brain follows the path of least resistance, and cognitive capabilities decline. Those who maintain sharp minds engage in what researchers call deliberate practice. Focused effort on activities designed to improve specific aspects of performance. For the mind, this means choosing to learn things that do not come easily, in domains where there is clear opportunity for improvement. The person reading a novel in their native language for pleasure is engaging in passive reading. The person reading dense philosophy in a language they are still learning, stopping frequently to look up concepts and parse difficult syntax, is engaging in deliberate learning. Both involve reading, but only the second creates the neural challenge necessary for cognitive development. Consider a person who decides to learn mathematics in midlife, despite having avoided it for decades. The early stages are frustrating. Concepts that seem simple to those trained in mathematics feel abstract and disconnected to the beginner. Yet the person who pushes through this initial discomfort, who does problem sets even when mistakes pile up, who seeks out additional explanations and perspectives, is engaging in the most powerful form of brain training available. The mathematical concepts become easier not because the mathematics changed, but because the brain formed new networks to understand them. These new networks do not simply help with mathematics. They strengthen the entire architecture of logical reasoning that applies across countless domains. The second habit of those who maintain mental sharpness is the practice of deep focus and concentration. In an age of constant distraction, this habit has become simultaneously more valuable and more challenging to maintain. The human attention system, refined over millions of years of evolution to detect threats and opportunities in the environment, is now bombarded with engineered stimuli designed by brilliant people specifically to capture and hold attention. Notifications, and more notifications create a constant interruption to sustained thought. Research on attention and cognitive performance demonstrates a stark reality. The brain cannot perform complex cognitive tasks while in a state of divided attention. The person checking their phone while working on a difficult problem is not working on that problem with their full cognitive capacity. They are working on the problem with whatever cognitive resources remain after allocating significant capacity to monitoring for new notifications and context switching between tasks. The cumulative effect of this constant partial attention is profound degradation in the quality of thinking, the depth of understanding, and the creative connections the mind can make. Those who maintain sharp minds protect their attention with the same dedication others might protect their financial assets. They create specific times and spaces free from distraction. They turn off notifications. They silence their phones. They close browser tabs not currently needed. They eliminate visual clutter from their work environment. This is not the behavior of someone paranoid about missing information. Rather, it is the behavior of someone who understands that every minute of genuine, focused cognitive work is more valuable than an hour of distracted half-attention. The practice of deep focus also involves understanding the concept of cognitive load. The human working memory can hold approximately 7 distinct pieces of information simultaneously. When a task requires holding more than this in mind, performance degrades rapidly. Those with sharp minds recognize this limitation and structure their work to respect it. They take notes. They break complex problems into simpler sub-problems. They write out their thinking to externalize it and free up cognitive capacity. They understand that writing is not simply recording thoughts. It is a thinking tool that amplifies cognitive capability. The third habit is the relentless pursuit of clarity. Much of human discourse exists in a fog of vagueness and imprecision. People speak of improving the system without clarifying which system, what aspects need improvement, by what metrics improvement would be measured, or what costs might be incurred in pursuit of that improvement. They think they understand complex topics, but have never really examined their understanding by trying to explain it simply to someone else. They make decisions without clearly articulating what the decision actually is, what the alternatives are, or what criteria should guide the choice. Clarity is both a habit and a tool. As a habit, it involves consistently pushing toward greater precision in thinking and communication. When someone makes a claim, the person committed to clarity asks what specifically they mean. When facing a problem, clarity seeking involves defining the problem precisely before attempting solutions. When evaluating an argument, it involves identifying the precise logical structure and examining each link in the chain of reasoning. This habit of seeking clarity is often experienced as uncomfortable by those around you. because people generally prefer the comforting vagueness of approximate understanding to the challenging precision of actual understanding. The practice of clarity extends inward as well. Those with sharp minds know their own thinking patterns. They are aware of their blind spots. They know the topics where they tend toward emotional reasoning rather than logical analysis. They know the domains where they have expertise and those where they lack it. This self-knowledge is not innate. It develops through the deliberate practice of examining their own thinking, tracking the accuracy of their predictions and assessments, and learning from their errors. The fourth habit underlying mental sharpness is the practice of physical health and its direct relationship to cognitive function. The brain is fundamentally a biological organ, and its performance depends on the conditions of the body supporting it. Sleep deprivation degrades cognition more profoundly than most people realize. A person who has slept 5 hours demonstrates cognitive deficits comparable to mild intoxication, yet may feel subjectively normal due to adaptation. Regular sleep, generally 7 to 9 hours for most adults, is not a luxury or a sign of laziness. It is essential maintenance of cognitive function. Exercise performs a similar essential function. Physical activity increases blood flow to the brain, promotes the growth of new neurons, strengthens neural connections, and helps regulate the neurotransmitters that underlie mood, motivation, and cognitive function. Those who maintain sharp minds generally exercise regularly, not for vanity or social obligation, but as a direct investment in cognitive capability. They recognize that 30 minutes of aerobic exercise is not time away from productive work on the mind. It is essential maintenance that enables more effective mental work in the subsequent hours. Nutrition similarly impacts cognition more directly than most people appreciate. The brain consumes approximately 20% of the body's calories while comprising only 2% of body weight. It requires specific nutrients, omega-3 fatty acids, B vitamins, minerals like magnesium and zinc, to function optimally. Those with sharp minds do not treat nutrition as an aesthetic concern, but as a performance variable. They experiment with different dietary approaches, observe their cognitive function under different nutritional conditions, and structure their eating patterns accordingly. The fifth habit is the cultivation of what might be called intellectual humility, combined with intellectual courage. Intellectual humility is the recognition that knowledge is always incomplete, that strong confidence often correlates poorly with accuracy, and that the smartest move is often to admit what you don't know. This habit runs counter to much cultural messaging that equates confidence with competence. Yet those with genuinely sharp minds know the difference. They are comfortable saying, "I don't know," and following it with, "but here's how I could find out." They welcome correction because they recognize that each error caught and corrected is an opportunity to improve their model of reality. Paradoxically, this humility coexists with intellectual courage, the willingness to think independently and to follow reasoning wherever it leads, even when it contradicts popular opinion or established consensus. Intellectual courage means reading carefully even when you disagree with the author's conclusions, specifically to understand the strongest version of their argument. It means considering objections to your own thinking before someone else raises them. It means changing your mind when evidence warrants change, despite the social cost of being seen as inconsistent. The cultivation of this combination, humility and courage, serves as a filtering mechanism for truth. The humble mind without courage accepts whatever authorities tell it. The courageous mind without humility clings to ideas despite evidence against them. Only the combination enables the relentless orientation toward truth that characterizes genuinely sharp thinking. Part 2. The transformation through practice. The story of mental development is fundamentally a story of compounding effects. A week of deep focus improves concentration only marginally, yet a year of consistent practice in these habits produces noticeable differences. A decade produces transformation. The person who at 40 years old implements these habits systematically can find themselves at 50 with cognitive capabilities superior to their younger selves, even as age-related decline theoretically occurs. This transformation occurs through the elimination of the weak self, the version of ourselves that resists challenge, that seeks comfort in established patterns, that makes excuses for inconsistency. The weak self is not evil or consciously chosen. It is the default state that emerges from the brain's preference for efficiency. The brain is fundamentally lazy in the economic sense. It prefers to minimize energy expenditure. This made sense in ancestral environments where calories were scarce. In modern environments where cognitive energy is abundant but often squandered, This default tendency works against our best interests. Destroying the weak self begins with recognizing it operating in real time. You notice yourself reaching for your phone when you encounter a difficult cognitive task. You observe yourself accepting the first explanation rather than probing deeper. You catch yourself moving forward with a decision despite uncertainty about what you're actually deciding. You recognize the internal narrative that says, "I'm not a math person," or "I'm bad at writing," or "I can't focus." These are the signatures of the weak self. It speaks in terms of fixed identity and settled limitations. The transformation begins when you stop accepting these claims about yourself and start treating them as hypotheses to be tested. You assume that you can improve in domains where you currently struggle, because neuroscience has established that the brain retains neuroplasticity throughout life. You test this assumption by engaging in deliberate practice in that domain. You encounter frustration. The weak self offers you an exit. "See, you're right, you can't do this." But if you persist, something remarkable occurs. The frustration gradually diminishes. Understanding deepens. Competence develops. The claim that "I can't" transforms into evidence-based knowledge of current capability with clear understanding of how to improve further. This process, repeated across multiple domains, produces a fundamental shift in self-conception. You move from seeing yourself as a fixed entity with settled abilities to seeing yourself as a developing system with expandable capabilities. This shift is not mere positive thinking or motivational cheerleading. It is the only accurate model of human cognitive potential when that potential is tested against evidence. Neuroscience has conclusively established that the brain changes in response to experience. The question is not whether you can develop new capabilities. The evidence is overwhelming that you can. The question is whether you will engage in the practices that develop those capabilities. As the weak self is progressively eliminated, a new relationship to external criticism and challenge emerges. The weak self is fragile precisely because it depends on maintaining an inflated self-image. When external criticism arrives, it threatens this image. So the weak self defends against it, dismisses it, or internalizes it as proof of fundamental inadequacy. Either way, the feedback cannot be used for improvement, but the self that has systematically eliminated internal weaknesses through deliberate practice does not fear external criticism. It has already internalized a much more rigorous form of criticism through the process of deliberate learning. It has already confronted its own limitations directly. It has already experienced being wrong and used that experience to improve. When external criticism arrives, this stronger self can evaluate it dispassionately. What truth does it contain? How can I use this? What is inaccurate? What must I investigate further? This psychological posture makes the person difficult to harm through criticism or social pressure. They care about the truth more than they care about others' opinions of them. This is not arrogance. It is clarity. They have distinguished between their self-worth, which they understand as intrinsic and not dependent on performance, and their capability in specific domains, which they understand as a variable that can be improved through work. This distinction creates psychological resilience that external events cannot penetrate. Someone cannot destroy your fundamental worth by criticizing your work. They can only provide feedback that helps you improve that work if you choose to learn from it. The manifestation of this in behavior is what observers notice and label as confidence or competence. Someone will work with you on a project and observe that you accept constructive criticism without defensiveness, that you ask clarifying questions when you don't understand something, that you can acknowledge limitations in your expertise while still bringing value to the project, that you seem oriented toward the actual goal rather than toward looking good or being right. These qualities make you valuable to work with, not because you are perfect, but precisely because you are committed to continuous improvement and not emotionally invested in hiding current shortcomings. The practice of destroying the weak self also involves establishing what might be called personal accountability systems. The weak self operates largely in darkness, unexamined thoughts, unstated assumptions, disconnected behaviors. Bringing these into light is the first step toward changing them. Those who maintain sharp minds often keep records of their learning progress. They track which habits they have maintained and which they have neglected. They review this data regularly and adjust their approaches based on what the data shows. This might sound mechanical, but in practice it is liberating. You cannot improve what you do not measure. You cannot maintain discipline for practices that remain vague and unmonitored. Some maintain learning journals where they record new knowledge acquired, questions that emerged, connections to previous learning, and plans for further development. Some track their cognitive performance through simple self-assessment, clarity of thinking, ability to focus, quality of decisions made. Some maintain records of deliberate practice, documenting time spent in focused learning and the specific areas of improvement targeted. This practice of documentation serves multiple functions simultaneously. It provides data for self-assessment. It slows down thinking enough to deepen learning. It creates a record of growth that provides motivation through visible progress. The transformation also involves the development of what might be called second-order thinking. Thinking about your thinking. Rather than simply having thoughts, you observe your thoughts and examine their origins. You notice when you are reasoning from emotion rather than evidence. You catch yourself making assumptions without checking them against reality. You observe your tendency to seek information that confirms what you already believe, and consciously seek disconfirming evidence instead. This practice is sometimes called metacognition. It is thinking about how you think. Second-order thinking prevents the trap that catches many intelligent people. The intelligent person who has not developed the habit of examining their own thinking can become increasingly confident in increasingly inaccurate models of reality. Their intelligence allows them to construct elaborate justifications for their errors. They can explain away contradicting evidence. They can find clever reasons why the results they are experiencing is someone else's fault. Meanwhile, the less intelligent person who practices self-examination catches themselves in errors earlier and adjusts course. The capacity for self-awareness turns out to be far more predictive of actual good outcomes than raw IQ. Part 3. The invulnerability that comes from internal strength. There exists a paradox in human vulnerability that most people never fully appreciate. People are not primarily harmed by external events and external enemies. Rather, they are harmed by their own responses to external events, responses shaped by internal weaknesses. The person with poor emotional regulation cannot handle criticism without either collapsing into shame or lashing out in anger. The person without clear values cannot navigate ethical dilemmas without compromising themselves. The person without developed cognitive discipline cannot think clearly when stakes are high and emotions are strong. The person without intellectual humility becomes trapped in false beliefs, unable to see reality clearly. These are not challenges primarily posed by the external world. They are vulnerabilities created by the person themselves through neglect of their own development. When a person systematically eliminates these internal weaknesses through the practices described above, something remarkable occurs. They become remarkably difficult to harm. This is not because external challenges disappear. Life will always present difficulties. Rather, it is because the challenges no longer trigger the internal vulnerabilities that would otherwise undermine them. The person receives criticism and can evaluate it objectively rather than spiraling into defensive reactivity. They face setbacks and can learn from them rather than seeing them as evidence of fundamental inadequacy. They encounter people who attempt to manipulate them and see through the manipulation because their own thinking is clear and grounded in reality. Consider a person who has developed strong habits of deliberate learning and intellectual clarity. Someone attempts to convince them of something false through clever rhetoric and selective evidence. What happens? The person's habit of clarity prompts them to ask careful questions. Their practice of examining evidence dispassionately allows them to notice when the argument rests on unsupported assumptions. Their commitment to truth-seeking leads them to seek disconfirming evidence. Their intellectual humility makes them willing to change their mind based on better evidence. But that same humility also makes them skeptical of someone trying to convince them in the absence of rigorous justification. In other words, they cannot be deceived easily because their mind works in ways that make deception nearly impossible to sustain. Consider a person who has practiced deep focus and eliminated the weak self that constantly seeks distraction. Someone tries to disrupt them through creating chaos or demanding constant attention. What happens? The person maintains their focus on what matters. They are not derailed by the distraction because they have trained their attention to follow their own priorities rather than external stimuli. The attempt to disrupt through chaos fails because this person has specifically developed resilience against that form of disruption. Consider a person who has integrated physical health into their life and experiences consistent, sharp cognitive function. Someone attempts to exploit them through a situation designed to overwhelm their capacity to think clearly. What happens? Their cognitive function remains strong because they have maintained the physical conditions necessary for clear thinking. The attack fails because it relies on diminished judgment that never manifests. This constellation of habits creates what might be called authentic confidence, not the fragile confidence that comes from always succeeding or from avoiding challenges, but the robust confidence that comes from repeatedly facing challenges, working through them, learning from the process, and emerging stronger. This confidence is unshakable because it is rooted in repeated evidence of one's own capability to develop, to learn, to overcome obstacles, and to improve. It cannot be undermined by a single failure because you have experienced failure, learned from it, and continued forward multiple times already. The person who has destroyed their weak self has also become difficult to control through shame or social pressure. The weak self is controlled through these mechanisms because it desperately wants to be liked and fears judgment. But the self that has engaged in the work of internal development has examined these fears directly. It has asked whether the opinions of others should actually determine its behavior. It has distinguished between respectful feedback that contributes to growth and harmful judgment that diminishes others. It has made deliberate choices about which social groups and values it will adopt and which it will reject. In short, it has seized control of its own value system, rather than accepting it passively from the surrounding culture. This creates a person who cannot be manipulated through social pressure because the manipulation has been inoculated against. Someone attempts to control them through shame, suggesting they should do something because others would judge them if they didn't. The response is a clear-eyed assessment. Do I agree with this value? Is my behavior aligned with values I've deliberately chosen? If yes, the shame has no power. If no, then the shame becomes useful feedback that their behavior needs realignment, but it cannot be used as a tool to control them toward values they do not actually hold. The journey through these 7 habits and the progressive destruction of the weak self creates a person who is both vulnerable and invulnerable in paradoxical ways. They are vulnerable in the sense that they acknowledge their limitations, admit what they don't know, change their minds when evidence warrants, and take full responsibility for their actions. These are the vulnerabilities of honesty. But they are invulnerable in the sense that this very honesty and willingness to acknowledge limitations actually makes them stronger. They cannot be deceived by someone pointing out flaws because they have already identified and are actively addressing those flaws. They cannot be trapped in false beliefs because they continuously test their beliefs against reality. They cannot be caught unprepared by change because they have made continuous learning a habit. The practical manifestations of this invulnerability appear in many domains. In professional contexts, the person is promoted because they are easy to work with, continuously improving, and capable of handling increased responsibility. In personal relationships, they are valued as someone who listens carefully, acknowledges their own errors, and grows from feedback. In creative pursuits, they produce better work because they have the discipline to persist through difficulties and the clarity to recognize what is actually good. In moments of crisis, they function better because their mind remains clear and they can think strategically rather than emotionally. But perhaps most importantly, the person who is engaged in the work of destroying their weak self no longer suffers the internal discord that arises from living incongruently with their values. The weak self constantly generates this discord. You know what you should do, but do the opposite. You claim to value learning but avoid challenge. You say health is important but maintain destructive patterns. This constant internal contradiction generates stress, reduces resilience, and consumes cognitive capacity that could otherwise be directed toward valued goals. When the weak self is progressively eliminated and behavior becomes aligned with deliberate values, this internal discord decreases dramatically. The person experiences greater peace because they are no longer fighting themselves. The trajectory for someone who has implemented these 7 habits is not one of constant progress without setbacks. Rather, it is one of overall improvement, punctuated by periodic steps backward, each of which becomes an opportunity for learning. Bad sleep or high stress might temporarily diminish focus. A missed week of deliberate learning does not erase previous learning, but does require recommitting to the practice. A setback or failure can trigger the weak self temporarily, trying to defend against the pain through denial or blame. But the person who has developed these habits has also developed the metacognitive capacity to recognize this and redirect attention back toward learning and improvement. Over months and years, the cumulative effect is transformation. The person becomes more competent in their domains of focus, not because they were specially gifted, but because they practiced the specific habits that develop competence. They become more resilient to setbacks because they have reframed setbacks as data rather than judgments. They become more effective in relationships because they have eliminated the defensive patterns that undermine connection. They become more creative because they have the focus necessary to engage deeply with complex problems. They become more influential not because they have learned persuasion techniques, but because they are genuine and their perspective comes from careful thinking and real competence. The person who is engaged in this work also typically experiences a shift in what they fear. The weak self fears many things: criticism, failure, judgment, being wrong, lack of status, missing opportunities. As the weak self is progressively eliminated, these fears lose their power. What remains is something more grounded: awareness of genuine risks that warrant attention, balanced against recognition of capacity to manage those risks. The person becomes less anxious overall, because anxiety is often generated by unexamined fears and internal conflicts rather than by actual threats. When fears are examined and addressed through skill development, anxiety decreases naturally. The story of destroying one's weak self is not a one-time event, but an ongoing process. There is always another area of weakness to address, another habit to strengthen, another layer of understanding to develop. But this endless journey is not a burden for those who have engaged in the process. Rather, it becomes the primary source of meaning and satisfaction. The person who is continuously learning, continuously improving, continuously becoming more capable is engaged in the most fundamentally human activity, the development and expression of potential. This engagement itself becomes a source of deep satisfaction that external success can never fully provide. In conclusion, the person who has systematically destroyed their weak self through the practice of the 7 habits, deliberate learning, deep focus, clarity, physical health, intellectual humility combined with courage, personal accountability, and metacognitive awareness, has created something far more valuable than any external success. They have created a mind that remains sharp throughout life, resistant to deterioration, capable of continuous growth, and genuinely difficult to harm. They have created a self that cannot be easily deceived, controlled through manipulation, or undermined by external events. They have created the conditions for genuine resilience, authentic confidence, and deep satisfaction with the process of becoming. The remarkable truth is that this outcome is available to anyone willing to engage in the necessary practices. It requires no special talent, no unusual circumstances, no fortunate background. It requires only clarity about what is worth developing, commitment to the habits that develop it, and the willingness to face difficulty in service of growth. The mind that pursues this path may indeed become sharper than most, but more importantly, it becomes a mind that is genuinely free, free from the tyranny of its own weaknesses, free to think clearly, free to learn, free to grow, and free to contribute meaningfully to the world.